Order. Dame Diana Johnson to move the motion.
Thank you, Dame Angela, and it's a great pleasure to serve under you this afternoon. I'd like to thank the 30 MPs from across all political parties who have supported the call for this important debate, including my co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood and the Father of the House, the Honourable Member for Worthing West. And it is good to see so many MPs here this afternoon. I'm very grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate on the infected blood inquiry and Sir Robert Francis's report on the framework for compensation and redress for victims of infected blood. I'd like to welcome the Minister and the Shadow Minister this afternoon as well. However, it is very disappointing that the Government did not find time for an oral statement in the House earlier this year when it published Sir Robert Francis's study. Can I just say to the Minister that it would have been much better to have had a full debate in government time on this matter, rather than MPs having to use the backbench business route. One thing that I have learned about campaigning in Parliament on this issue is that you have to fight for every small step forward, and government usually have to be dragged to Parliament to explain themselves. And I think we've had more urgent questions on this topic than almost any other in recent years. So 12 years ago, a man named Glenn Wilkinson walked into my MP's surgery in Hull. And what Glenn told me that day would prompt me to join a campaign already decades old to expose the largest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS and to fight for justice for those infected and affected by the contaminated blood scandal. And it's very important to remember that this is about individuals and the effect this disaster has had on their lives and their families. During routine dental work conducted in hospital because he was a haemophiliac, Glenn was infected with hepatitis C, a virus that can cause serious and life-threatening damage to the liver. The health service that was supposed to keep Glenn healthy and safe had given him a life-threatening disease, and Glenn was not alone. We now know that as a result of being given infected blood and blood products by the NHS during the 1970s and the 1980s, over 3,000 people have already died. And even today, one person still dies on average every 4 days. Thousands more live with blood-borne viruses such as hepatitis and HIV. And of course, the haemophilia community was overwhelmingly affected. But many people who received blood transfusions, for example during childbirth or after a car accident, were also infected. Now, what Glenn was seeking at that meeting with me in 2010 was simple. It was the truth about what had happened to him and to thousands of others, and to ensure that such a disaster can never happen again. And acknowledging the scale of this catastrophe would also hopefully compel the government to take responsibility for its ongoing effects. People left bereaved, living in pain, requiring care, unable to work. Since Glenn and I met, I have been honoured and humbled to campaign alongside a whole movement of courageous individuals whose lives have been changed by this disaster, as well as many organisations, including Contaminated Blood, Tainted Blood, Factor 8, the Haemophilia Society, Haemophilia Scotland, Haemophilia Wales, and so many others. Plus, of course, members of both Houses of Parliament. And I just want to mention the Noble Lord Frank Field, who is now very gravely ill, but was there at the start of the fight for justice, and the decades of support, too, from the late Lord Alf Morris. And I would like to say that over the years, the response from leaders in the NHS, the Department of Health and Social Care, and government has been marked by contrition, openness, and a fervent desire to support those living with the ongoing consequences. But very sadly, it hasn't. And that is how a disaster became a scandal. Yes, I'm happy to give way.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and thank her and the Father of the House for bringing this debate today. She says there hasn't been enough contrition. She's absolutely right, and I would like to raise a case of my constituent whose father was a haemophiliac, infected by HIV and hepatitis C, and the feelings of shame that went with that as well even though it's completely unwarranted, were very true at the time. He died in 1995. My constituent has been fighting for years. I'm not naming my constituent today. But does she agree that there has been not only a lack of empathy, but also far too many clerical errors along the way, and that really the time is now for formal apology? I do welcome the letter I've had from the Minister, the member for Lewis, which I will be forwarding to my constituent later today, but I think we need to go a little bit further.
Yeah. I'm very grateful for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with what the Honourable Gentleman says. I just want to say that there is evidence suggesting that concerns about the unfolding disaster were covered up at the time, as the Honourable Gentleman is referring to. And I think attempts to retrospectively reveal the truth via an independent inquiry were repeatedly resisted by successive governments. And it's only now, 5 decades after it began, after a very long-fought campaign, that we have the public inquiry underway under the distinguished leadership of Sir Brian Langstaff. And I was very pleased that in advance of Sir Brian's inquiry concluding, the former Paymaster General, the Right Honourable Member for Portsmouth North, commissioned a study from Sir Robert Francis KC on a framework for compensation and redress for victims of infected blood, to ensure that no time would be lost when Sir Brian publishes his final report, in readiness for, as seems highly likely, that he will recommend compensation is to be paid. Unfortunately, although the study results were sent to the Cabinet Office in March this year, the government refused to publish it at that time. Instead, they promised they would publish it alongside a full government response. But the study was actually leaked to the press, and the government were then forced to publish the report in June. However, there is still no official response to Sir Robert's study. So 5 months on, we're still waiting for that full government response. We've looked very much forward to what the Minister has to say today about Sir Robert's study, as the government has now had in total 8 months to review the findings of the study, and I hope the Minister will be able to provide a detailed response and firm commitments. And just to remind the Minister again, time is of the essence with this group. Absolutely. And the inquiry will already have been running for 6 years when it concludes next year. Too many lives have been lost. Too much suffering has been caused. The victims of the contaminated blood scandal must not be made to wait any longer, either for answers or for action. And what comes next from the government should be marked by openness and a full commitment to deliver justice to everyone affected by this scandal. Yes, I'm happy to go away.
For giving way for securing this debate. I've also heard constituents who are extremely concerned about the amount of time it's been taking to achieve justice. Nobody is getting any younger waiting for the compensation that they deserve, whether they're immediately affected or part of a family that's been affected. Does she share those concerns that justice increasingly delayed risks becoming justice denied?
Absolutely. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right in saying that. I just now want to turn to what I'm looking for from the Minister in his remarks today. There are 3 things that I'm looking for. First of all, number 1, I want him to make a pledge. I want him to pledge on behalf of the government today that the government will implement the infected blood inquiry recommendations in full. That would clearly demonstrate the government's commitment to deliver justice to the victims and their families. And also, I would like him to confirm the date of the publication of the government's full response to Sir Robert's study. My number 2 ask is preparation. So I want the government now to prepare a full compensation framework. Please do not wait months to start this vital process and delay access to redress. Payments need to be made in a timely way, and the process needs to be expeditious. We need a clear timetable of action from the government. Specifically, how will infected and affected people be involved in the establishment and operation of the compensation framework, just as they have been at the heart of Sir Brian Langstaff's inquiry? And I want to echo the mantra, nothing about us without us. So can the Minister also confirm that work has already started on the setting up of the compensation framework in anticipation of Sir Brian's final recommendations. What resources has the government allocated to the setting up costs and the operation of the compensation framework? When will the process of registering bereaved parents, carers, children and dependents to ensure they receive compensation begin? How will the government address the needs of people affected by the infected blood scandal, who currently fall through the gaps of the restricted framework of financial assistance available today? I'll just finish this point, and that's particularly for those individuals whose medical records were lost or destroyed. I'm happy to give way.
I'm very grateful for allowing my intervention. She's absolutely right about the medical records. There's also the case of individuals who were caring for people as well, and that they too need to be compensated because they went through years caring for perhaps a family member.
Absolutely, I agree with the honourable gentleman who raised that point. Just to raise a couple of other things before I conclude. Does the government have plans and a timetable for introducing legislation to prevent compensation payments being reduced via taxation? At the moment, HMRC are merely being asked to exercise their discretion, and that does need to be looked at. I also will write to the Minister regarding a few other specific issues which have been raised with me. I think that will need further consideration from the Minister. My third ask is around payments. I'd like the Minister to commit to paying fair compensation to all. So far, interim payments have been restricted to people infected and bereaved partners. Whilst these payments are of course very welcome, bereaved parents, children and, as the honourable gentleman just said, carers have not received any financial support for their loss. And these people must be included in the compensation framework as Sir Robert set out very clearly in his findings. Very happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and as she rightly says, the interim compensation payments made to those infected and bereaved partners have huge holes in them, with too many people unable to access that support, including constituents of mine whose parents were killed by infected blood or infected blood products. So does my honourable friend agree that the government must compensate both infected and affected victims of infected blood and blood products, and that the compensation ALB should be able to begin accepting compensation claims as soon as the inquiry reports?
Absolutely, and we are not alone in saying this, because Sir Robert says this very clearly in his report, in his study. So, yes, but I am then going to conclude, because I know there's so many other people who want to speak, but yes, I will give way.
Thank you for allowing me to intervene, and thank you for calling this important debate. At the beginning of your speech, you quite rightly mentioned all the organisations that have campaigned to try and get justice for not only the victims and the families, and that particularly relates to compensation. Could I also thank the chair of Haemophilia Wales, Lynn Kelly, and her team, who have been relentless in their determination to get justice for all those across Wales, and I'd like to thank them specifically. Thank you.
Absolutely, I echo those comments as well. I just want to conclude now. So, Minister, what I'm looking for is pledge, prepare and pay. Those are the criteria the government will be judged on, and that is how the government can best bring this scandal to an end and ensure that survivors and affected families can finally access justice and receive compensation for the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS.
The question is that this House has considered the infected blood inquiry and compensation framework. Before calling the next speaker, I just want to give an indication to everyone, because there's a lot of people wanting to speak. I'm going to suggest a voluntary time limit of around 4 minutes. That will ensure that everybody gets in. Call Dame Neil Griffiths.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, first of all, I just want to take a short moment to reflect just how long people have been waiting for justice. It's now 40 years since the danger of contracting AIDS or HIV from contaminated blood products was first published. So, those who received contaminated blood and their families, and many who have passed away in the meantime, have been waiting far, far, far too long. And it's even 6 years from when this inquiry was set up. And I pay tribute to all those who've campaigned tirelessly, including my honourable friend, the member for Hull North, and Nigel Miller from my constituency. Now, my constituent Nigel Miller reiterates the point made by my honourable friend that the government should publish their response to Sir Robert's study as soon as possible. And he in particular wants to draw attention to the need for compensation for the parents of the 300 plus children who died of AIDS, that they should receive some payments, and the children who lost parents, often both because the person who was infected was not told and so infected their partner, and they too should receive compensation. He wants me also to mention that interim compensation payments should be made urgently to the estates of those who've died, so that all those who are infected are recognised, and so that some help can be given to those who continue to receive none. And I do hope that the Minister will be able to respond on that point today. Now, I'm not going to use up time in this serious debate to make cheap political points, but I think we all know about the websites that crash, about the phone lines that go unanswered, about the utter frustration of having to wait months and months. So I would really urge the Minister now, with only 6 months until the end of the inquiry, to make sure that there are absolutely no further delays and to be absolutely ready with everything up and running and ready to go, ready to receive the final detail of when the final study is fully concluded and reported on. So the government needs to have people ready, whether they're to be appointed or whether they're to be seconded from other departments. They need to be fully trained. Yeah. All the IT systems seem to be in place, and the very important issue of how people can be contacted, how their details can be verified, so that it's all done in advance, so that as soon as the final details do become available, everything will be ready to run and nobody will be facing any further delays. So on that note, Dame Angela, I conclude my remarks and I look forward to the Minister responding.
Thank you very much. It's been drawn to my attention that there's a journalist in the public gallery using a recording device. With the best will in the world, that is not allowed. These proceedings are recorded and made publicly available. I would ask you now, sir, please to turn that device off. And if you don't, I will have to ask the officials to escort you out. I don't want you to do that. I want you to turn it off and get the publicly available feed. Could you do that, sir? Thank you. Call Sir Peter Bottomley.
Can I congratulate Dame Diana, the Honourable Member from Hull North, for all the work she's done, for the partnership she's made with the infected groups and with her work with the Hemophilia Society, who've helped to support the all-party group, which would not have existed or been effective without her. So thank you very much for that. When I was at university in 1963 to 66, I used to read some of the monographs by the Institute of Economic Affairs. Some of them were interesting, some I thought were right. One that was wrong, which came after that time, was in 1968, one called The Price of Blood, which argued in some way that commercial market in blood products could in some cases be useful. Richard Titmuss, who was the founding father of Professor of Social Administration and Social Policy at the London School of Economics, where both my mother and my wife studied, wrote The Gift Relationship, published in 1970. And at the risk of giving a reference, can I recommend the Medical Classic Review in the BMJ 2011, 342 D2078, where Parita Mukta gives a retrospective review. Richard Titmuss was looking to see how the altruism of the gift of blood, one person donating, being the donor, one receiving, not knowing each other, but each knowing how the system worked, did an immense amount of good. My mother was the first person in our family to have an HIV test because she'd had a blood donation during an operation, and she suspected some of her children or grandchildren didn't use her toothbrush rather than anybody else's, so she wondered if she could infect them. And my wife in 1975 received 8 units of blood after a medical emergency. So the exposure is something that we're aware of. But what kindled my interest was a close friend who had been a haemophiliac, who had received factor VIII when everyone thought that was a good prophylactic. It was backed by the Haemophilia Society, it was backed by everybody. But it turned out to be disastrous. And it turned out to be disastrous for reasons which the inquiry are going into, and I'm not going to get involved in that. We've each had constituents. Some, if we're lucky, are still alive. Others have died. And during the time that people have been ill, they've suffered all kinds of indignities. The worst, described to me by constituents, is every time they go into a hospital with a clinician they don't know, they're asked how much alcohol they have, because liver disease can be an indication of infection, or it can be an indication of heavy drinking. I argued that people ought to be able to have a flag which would say, don't ask these questions of this person, because they have to answer them several times a year, and it's just deeply wrong. You ought to be able to say, here, look at these 3 or 4 paragraphs, you'll know who I am, you know what my condition is, now treat the thing I'm bringing to you. Don't start suspecting me, as others have, of having excess alcohol. I believe that government is beginning to respond in the right way. I've often had disagreements, even within the family, of the difference between those affected by this infected or contaminated blood. I think there is a distinction to be drawn between that and normal medical procedures going wrong. On a scale and in a way which is now being recognised, I think we owe a debt to the judge and to his helpers, we owe a debt to Sir Robert Francis, and we owe a debt to the families themselves who have, I think, with dignity and with persistence, brought the House to this debate. What the Minister says today won't be the end of it, but I hope it'll be a good step along the way. I'm grateful for him being here, and I think if we need to have another debate, I will put my name to it as well. Thank you.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Dame Eagle. I'm delighted to serve under your chairmanship today. I want to open by paying tribute to those affected by this disaster, those infected themselves, but also their families, those who have campaigned for years, either as infected people or in support of them, but also all those who have simply had their lives changed. The energy it has taken to campaign for 50 years and still not even receive the limited justice that financial compensation can bring. The stigma they've faced, the loss of opportunities to work, to have family, to have insurance. We've heard them all in detail, and we can't hear them today because this debate is simply going to be too short. I think that it is important that we remember the 2017 debate. And I remember speaking at that time. I had been a surgeon for over 30 years before I came to this place. And in the 80s, when this scandal began to leak out, I remember the impact that it had on me. I was shocked at the idea that trusting something that was signed off by a government or agency as safe, I might have transfused someone to save their life, or maybe we were pretty profuse with blood at that time, I would say, to simply deal with post-surgical anemia, and I might have destroyed their life. And that had a big impact on me. It changed my practice. I stopped using a scalpel. I started using argon-assisted diathermy, and my theatre staff would moan about how obsessional I was about not having to transfuse patients by not losing blood in the first place. Now, all patients gained from that. But if you were dealing with someone from a big car accident or had been stabbed or shot, you don't have that luxury. So blood transfusion is not something that clinicians can avoid. And I'm depressed that 5 years on from that debate, which led to the inquiry, we're still only at this point. We thought that we would actually have been at a point of bringing this to an end. Absolutely everyone in this chamber will welcome the completion of the evidence sessions, the interim report, and particularly the delivery of the interim payments to those infected or their bereaved partners. But has already been pointed out, bereaved parents and children are not included. nor those who may have been unpaid family carers, who may not even fall into one of those groups, who have cared for years for someone who is now deceased, and therefore they won't even in the short term be eligible for care payments through an infected person. So can the Minister tell us, I'm merely repeating what the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North has already said, but when will the registration of all those affected actually begin? What work is being done on establishing the full compensation framework? So as has been said, it is ready to go the moment the decision is made. And when will the government publish its full response to the Sir Robert Francis report? Because at the moment we're talking as if all those recommendations are accepted. The community are trusting they're all accepted, but we don't actually know that. I would like to have seen a proper debate in the chamber. Yeah. It warranted that. It warranted the full time so we could explore the detail. I think it's important we remember that in 2017 it wasn't what any of us said in the debate that achieved the inquiry. That was agreed to in the morning because the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead realised it was going to be the first time they would lose a vote because of the cross-party strength of feeling. It's therefore important that all MPs in this chamber, all the supporters of this campaign, but in this House, continue to work cross-party, as we're seeing here, to make sure the government don't drag their feet, and please deliver the justice that it is long past time of delivering.
Margaret Greenwood.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and I congratulate my honourable friends, the member for Kingston upon Hull North and the member for Worthing West on securing this debate and for all of the work that they have done on this important issue. And I pay tribute to everyone campaigning on this too. As we know, during the 1970s and 1980s, thousands of UK patients contracted HIV, hepatitis virus, or both from contaminated blood or blood products. I would like to raise the case of one of my constituents who was one of those patients. She is now being recognised officially as a victim of the contaminated blood scandal. However, getting there has, in her words, been a long, upsetting and depressing process, both in an administrative sense and in terms of her health. For many years, she was denied any recognition or support due to lost medical records. She said there were times when she decided it was best for her to just admit she was beaten and move on. But thankfully, she persisted, and as I say, is now rightly recognised as a victim. In terms of her health, despite being cured of hepatitis C several years ago, as a result of having had it, she's been left with a number of other extremely serious health issues, and she's still suffering today, not only medically but emotionally, due in part to the stigma that is attached to hepatitis C and blood-borne viruses. And of course, there can be no place for stigma in relation to health in a supportive and understanding society. Excuse me. The strain on her and her family, including her children, over the years has been enormous, and their lives have been profoundly affected. My constituent told me she often wonders how different her life would have been if she hadn't required a blood transfusion at birth. I'm sure everybody affected by this, like everyone else, she just wants conclusion and closure. So I note the government's written response of the 5th of September, which notes Sir Robert Francis QC's independent study with options for a workable and fair framework of compensation for those infected and affected by the tragedy. It also notes the recommendations by Sir Robert and by Sir Brian Langstaff, Chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry, of making interim payments of no less than £100,000 to all those infected and all bereaved partners currently registered on UK infected blood support schemes and those who register between now and the inception of any future scheme. The Government has confirmed that infected individuals and bereaved partners who are registered with any of the 4 UK infected blood support schemes receive their payments by the 28th of October. However, as the Hepatitis C Trust has pointed out, these are only interim payments, and this is just the start of the process of setting up the full compensation scheme. I would indeed give way.
For giving way. The Honourable Lady's mentioning the interim scheme, but I wonder if she would also support the notion of that being extended to families and carers, such as my constituent, Justine Gordon-Smith, who cared for her father. Randolph has experienced considerable personal trauma herself. That must be across hundreds and hundreds of families throughout the UK, and that they deserve to have their problems and the issues that they've experienced acknowledged as well by the government?
I thank the honourable member for making her comments. She makes really, really important points on behalf of her constituent. Thank you. Furthermore, the government has still not responded in full to Sir Robert Francis's report on the compensation framework. So can the Minister say when that response will come? The infected blood inquiry is of course ongoing and is due to report in mid-2023. It's absolutely vital that the government acts as swiftly as possible when the inquiry's final report is published, and that is the very least that victims such as my constituents deserve.
Damien Moore.
Thank you, Dame Angela, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North, and my honourable friend, the Member for Worthing West, for securing this important debate. And I think the breadth of representation here today shows how widely this scandal affects all corners of the United Kingdom. It has damaged many innocent lives, and it continues to damage lives. I know from conversations I've had with my affected constituents the truly devastating impact it has had on their lives. While we wait for the publication of the infected blood inquiry's findings scheduled for summer 2023, I'm glad that we've had started to pay the interim compensation payments to those directly affected. Sir Robert Francis' publication of his recommendations for a framework for the compensation and redress of victims in June this year clearly laid out the benefit of such payments, backed up by Sir Brian Langstaff's report on interim payments the next month. Following these, it is welcome that the government rightly announced in August that an interim compensation payment of £100,000 will be made to registered infected individuals and bereaved partners. These are all steps in the right direction and something that many of us in this room have been pushing for on behalf of our constituents for many years. But I echo the sentiments of other members present. There is still so much more we can do. Sir Francis ultimately published 19 recommendations, yet so far the government has adopted just one on interim compensation payments. Of primary importance, and one that is directly affecting some of my constituents in Southport, is the eligibility for such payments. One particularly heart-rending case involves a constituent of mine who lost both of his boys when they were young. No amount of money can ever right the loss of one's child, and we must remember that these payments at best can seek to right, in a legal sense, the wrong done. The moral argument for making such payment is clear, yet no payment has been made. My constituent has been through unimaginable grief. The lady.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way and want to support the point that he was making with a case from my own constituency. And I know from conversations with those affected the profound and lasting consequences for children of those infected, not only in terms of dealing with their bereavement, but also being bullied at school during the most brutal period of AIDS stigma. It's appalling to me and to I think any right-minded person looking at the interim payments that have been made so far, that children of those infected have not yet been eligible for financial support. Would the honourable gentleman join me and others in making sure that both children of those infected are included, as well as a matter of urgency from the government?
I agree with the remarks made by the honourable lady. Many years after the constituent of mine is still, going through a terrible time with the traumatic effects. It's not just a psychological thing that actually doesn't leave people, and he's still ineligible for the compensation for the death of his children. It's unacceptable, and so I ask why the government is yet to adopt Sir Robert's fifth recommendation, which would extend the eligibility to include my constituent and many others. The government is yet to give an emphatic statement in support of this, and has merely stated in a written parliamentary question that they fully expect Sir Robert's wide recommendations to inform the inquiry's final report. Yet the government needs not wait for the final report. It could simply adopt Sir Robert's first recommendation, accept that regardless of the inquiry's findings, there is a strong moral case for a publicly funded scheme to compensate the victims. It is good news that the first payments for those who are already eligible have landed in bank accounts. The government is making good progress on redressing this, but there's still more we can do. I do support all 19 of the recommendations and urge the government to adopt them at the earliest possible opportunity. All of us here can continue to stand up for the right payments for our constituents, because they have suffered in this scandal and they need justly compensated. We shall continue to fight, I am sure, till we feel that justice has been done. These are real people suffering across all of our constituencies, and we have a moral duty to do all we can to redress these wrongs.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Me, Dame Angela. It is indeed the personal stories that bring home the full horror of this scandal, and I wanted to pay tribute to one of my constituents, John Pryor, a severe haemophiliac who was infected with hepatitis C through contaminated blood products at York Hill Children's Hospital. His own mother injected him with these products until he was able to do so himself at the age of 11. Out of 35 children being treated with contaminated products at the hospital alongside my constituent, 19 were also infected with HIV. And it was only aged 20 that he discovered the truth of what had happened via his employer having known a full year before he actually did. The consequences for John have included advanced liver fibrosis, and he's faced really significant mental health issues. At one point he received letters 4 times in 10 years to say that he may have variant CJD. He suffered from the severe side effects of treatments that were only helping a small number of patients. He has described how he and his fellow victims felt that they have been used as guinea pigs and that they have been living on death row since they were infected. My constituent is of a similar age to me, but has already lived significantly longer than many of his peers who have not survived the impact of this scandal. So John's asks and my asks are exactly as set out so ably by the All-Party Parliamentary Group chairs, whose fantastic work I pay tribute to and I thank them for. And as the Honourable Member for Hull said, these can be neatly encapsulated in the 3 Ps: pledge, prepare and pay. So this is about fixing the interim compensation scheme. The interim scheme is welcome, but it has to be extended to those groups that we've already heard are excluded unfairly. It's about publishing the full response to Sir Robert Francis's report and committing to its full implementation. It's about accepting responsibility for what happened, and it's about ensuring that the compensation is administered by an independent body. It's about ensuring that work to administer the compensation scheme gets underway now so that it can be up and running as soon as possible. And it's about making good on the commitments on non-taxation and also heeding Sir Robert's remarks on increasing support payments as soon as possible. There are so many things that the government can and should be doing that others have referred to. I simply ask the government to be as nimble and as generous as possible as they proceed, and to ensure that they do not inflict any needless bureaucracy on people who have already seen the worst type of state negligence and recklessness over several decades. John's story is a personal tragedy for him and his family. The collective story of these amazingly brave and dignified campaigners is a national disgrace. We can't undo the appalling harm that was done, but by building on the excellent work of Robert Francis and Brian Langstaff, we can and we must deliver some sort of justice.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Angela, and as ever, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And fantastic, my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, for securing such a really important debate. But this, you know, I want to try and bring some human context to this. Plenty of facts, plenty of figures being mentioned, all which are 100% correct. But you know, the victims, the families, the carers, they're furious at this. This happened almost half a century ago and onwards. They've got every right to be absolutely not frustrated, appalled, disgusted at what and which way they've all been treated with regard to what's being described as a cover-up. Dear Angela, this is not just a scandal, not just a tragedy, but it's the biggest cover-up in the history of the NHS. And it's yet to be recognised by the current government. It was Lord Robert Winston who described the scandal as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. It was a previous Conservative Prime Minister, John Major, who said in the eyes of the Conservative government, those affected by the scandal simply have had bad luck. This isn't bad luck, dear Angela. Bad luck when we still got people in this nation dying 1 every 4 days as a result of this absolute cover-up. Not bad luck. What's he telling somebody who's lost their parents, lost somebody in their family, that this is bad luck? What an absolute disgrace. And then we've had the recent inquiries. The inquiry was called in 2017, 5 years ago, and it's certainly far from over. But it is right and necessary that most speakers, most members have brought up with regard to what's required. And of course, there's lots more required. It's not just about the individuals. It's not just about those who suffer. It's about their families. It's about the carers. It's about everyone who's been involved in this. I mean, what consideration has the government given to the lifelong effect of this condition in child development, as well as life expectancy, for example? Because it's so damaging, and we hear very little about this. There's been a whole number of questions raised, dear Angela, but I would just say that in the time I've got left, I was a member of Parliament when Sean Cavins, a 41-year-old individual, came to see. He was furious when he came to see me. And I was very much unaware about the scale of this issue. I was ignorant to the fact of what was happening with the contaminated blood situation. And he explained how difficult it had been. He gave me a tie, black for the dead, red for HIV victims, yellow for hepatitis C victims, and many of us have got the ribbon on where the lapels the shirt. So from then onwards, I've been privileged enough to be part of the campaign, be part of the APPG, seeking justice. This is an absolute outrage. It really is, and we've got to start, making this the feelings of the individuals heard, the feelings of the people who have died because of contaminated blood, who cannot speak for themselves. And I hope, dear Angela, that in the very near future we can come up with the answer to all the questions that my honourable colleagues and friends have mentioned, and get these people sorted out as soon as we possibly can. Thank you.
Jessica Morton.
Thank you very much, Dame Angela, and also can I thank my right honourable friend, the member for Hull North, for both securing this debate and having a parliamentary life well spent on this issue alone, I feel. And I also want to pay tribute to all the campaign groups out there, Tainted Blood, Contaminated Blood, Hemophilia Wales have been mentioned, and others who've not just kept this going in terms of the parliamentary agenda, but have served as a lifeline of help and support and advice to people going through this. A point made to me again last week by my constituents, and they've been a literal lifeline, and I want to thank them on behalf of my constituents. I also want to use this opportunity today to say in as strong as terms as I can to urge the Minister to extend the interim payments to bereaved parents and families. We are all relieved that some people have interim payments, but all who suffered must, because they are still living with this every day. And I too want to see the department getting on with the systems, getting on with setting them up now so that final compensation is out once the inquiry is complete as fast as possible with no further delays. Like all of us, we have constituents. I give way to the honourable member.
Very grateful for the honourable member giving way. Can I just ask her on the issue of the enhanced payment for patients with hepatitis C stage 1. In Northern Ireland, that scheme was backdated to 2019. In the rest of the UK, it's backdated to 2017. Now, the British government today have begun acting in the devolved space around budgets because we don't have a government, of course, in Northern Ireland. Would you agree with me that the British government should urgently backdate the payments in Northern Ireland to 2017 like everybody else has?
I very much thank the honourable member for that intervention, and I hope the Minister will address that in his closing remarks. I want to, like other honourable members, speak about their constituents and base my remarks on the Smiths from Newport, who lost their wonderful son, Colin, in 1990 after he received infected blood products projects from a prison in Arkansas. Colin was one of 380 children who were infected with HIV. Colin's mum and dad were amongst the youngest parents who lost children to the scandal, and now amongst an ever-diminishing group of bereaved parents still alive, with many having to wait for compensation and justice that never came. And over the years I've been the MP, it's been one of the greatest privileges to get to know the Smith family. And every time I meet with them, and I met them last week, I am taken back by the fortitude, the dignity and the bravery in face of this disgraceful injustice which they've lived through over all these years. I watched the evidence of the inquiry again last week, and I just do not know how they did it. And it's shameful that other than payments through the Skipton Fund, they have never been properly compensated for the loss of their son. And it's not about the money, it's about the acknowledgement of a life. Colin may not have been a breadwinner, but he would have been. And like other bereaved parents, they were excluded from the interim payments. And whilst they themselves were not directly infected by toxic blood projects, there is no metric under which the Smiths and others like them could not be considered victims of this scandal. I haven't got time to go through the multitude of indignities they suffered. Others, honourable members, have alluded to, having people painting AIDS dead graffiti on the side of their house, having to move home, Mr. Smith losing his job, not being able to get proper employment because of being the father of a child with HIV, and also the financial strain the family have borne, accruing debt, visiting Colin in hospital, transport, etc. There's been no formal acknowledgement of the indignities Colin suffered, and he never lived to receive a formal apology or compensation. This, the campaign will always fall short because no money can compensate, but compensation is still crucial if we're to acknowledge the depth of the failure of the British state. We were let down, these families were let down in the worst possible way. The Smiths are now in their 70s themselves, and although it's not about the money for them, I want them to live in comfort and to be able to support their surviving children in the years that they have left. That is not too much to ask. We cannot wait more years for this. So it's vital the government prepares now for further recommendations so there are no additional waits. The drawn-out process of contacting solicitors of the core participants to gather information for the compensation framework should be undertaken as soon as possible. So can I finally just say this? My ask of the Minister on behalf of the Smith family is simple. Do not make us call more debates. Please do not make us have to bring these families to London again and again. And please do not have to make us tell these really deeply painful stories about our constituents again and again. Please just please no more one words from the front bench. Please do, as my honourable friend says, pledge, prepare and pay. There is no time, and they have waited far, far too long already.
I now call the front bench contributions. Chris Stevens from the SNP.
Thank you, Dame Angela. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair and to serve under your chairpersonship. Let me first of all pay tribute, as others have, to the chair of the all-party parliamentary group. It's a privilege to be the vice chair, but I think the chair, the honourable member for Kingston Paul Hun North, and of course the father of the house, have led this particular all-party parliamentary group superbly. And I think that the Minister should be under no illusions whatsoever that not only have they been relentless, there are members of this House who will join them in being relentlessly campaigning on behalf of the victims of this scandal until justice is delivered. Because this is a tragedy which continues to devastate lives, and we will, as a cross-party group, continue to press the UK Government to pay fair and timely compensation to the bereaved families of the victims. As others have said, it has only been the campaigning work, political pressure, legal pressure, media pressure, which got the infected blood inquiry in the first place. It wasn't handed to us. I had to be campaigned for relentlessly, and I'll continue to use that word, relentlessly before that inquiry was given. And some of the evidence we've heard from that inquiry is absolutely, completely and utterly shocking. As the former Health Secretary and Health Minister Andy Burnham has called this scandal a colossal failure, saying there may even be a case for asking the Crown Prosecution Service to consider charges of corporate manslaughter in his evidence to the inquiry. And these comments follow his last speech in Parliament, of which I remember being there because it was a backbench business debate called by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Contaminated Blood, calling the scandal a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale, as the Honourable Member for Wansbeck alluded to. Now, I want to pay tribute to all of those affected by the infected blood scandal, as well as all those campaigners who've done a tremendous amount of work over the years to bring this issue forward. Now, I had two constituents who came to my surgery on Saturday, Dame Angela, Cathy Young, who had lost her husband, Davy, and Cathy's daughter, Nicola Stewart. Nicola has asked me to read the following, and how she sums up the situation when she was growing up. So, growing up with a dad with haemophilia, contracted through no fault of his own, was a massive secret. My sister and I were not made aware of Dad's infection, as Dad and Mum didn't want anyone knowing. I now know this was down to the stigma of the infection. I just knew something wasn't right with Dad's blood, so his toothbrushes and razors were all kept away. Then I hit my teenage years and things became a lot clearer, as Dad was going through treatments. After 2 rounds of attempts to clear it, it failed. My dad didn't fail, he gave it his all. He was so ill through it and mentally struggled through his treatments. After the second time it failed, this is when I believe we lost Dad. He was never the same man again. He went into total self-destruct. It was so painful, and we just couldn't help him. He didn't want the help. It isn't until now that I understand why he hit the self-destruct button. It was horrendous. At a time when I was going through my exams, it was terribly hard to concentrate on my future at school when so much was going on at home. Mum and Dad's relationship fell apart. Dad moved out and Mum tried her best to continue to pay the mortgage. I was working part-time at this point as I was still at school. I worked as much as I could and gave Mum every penny I earned to help pay the mortgage, as did my older sister. It was a lot for only being 17. We couldn't keep up, so we lost our home. Dad died when I was only 23, far too early to be losing a parent. He's been gone 13 years now, and I still cannot speak about him or what happened without crying, as you witnessed yourself on Saturday. I always explain it like I'm stuck in the grief process. I can't get past the acceptance stage, as he died through no fault of his own, and no one has been held accountable for it. It is a cruel form of grieving when the answers are out there, but no one has been interested in looking and sometimes even listening. My dad has missed out on so much. Myself and my sister both walked down the aisle without my dad at our side. I have 2 children who never met their granddad, but know him as the granddad that lives in heaven. My dad didn't see me graduate when I finally went back to education in my 30s. All the big things that your dad is supposed to be there for, he didn't get to do it through no fault of his own. Dame Angela, that's one family. That's a daughter of a victim of what they went through. And that's why we will continue to be relentless until that justice is delivered. Dame Angela. And I want to pay tribute to Nicola for sharing those words with me. That takes a lot for a constituent to write to a Member of Parliament now. I know we're not all scary, and I certainly don't believe I'm scary, but people are sometimes scared to write those words, and I want to pay tribute to Nicola for doing that. We urge the Government, Dame Angela, to allow all those affected by contaminated blood to register with the support schemes and ensure payments are available to bereaved parents, to bereaved partners, parents, children and carers. And I hope the Minister will confirm today that the issue of carers will be looked at and respected, because there are so many people who have taken years and cared for someone for years as they went through what they've had to go through. Now, the UK Government must publish a response to Sir Robert's study immediately and must now work to ensure the arm's length body can begin accepting compensation claims as soon as any inquiry reports. And I hope the Minister will confirm that today, that the Government do intend to respond to the study because it's important that it does so, and it is frustrating that we've had promises that there was going to be a response to this study and we're still waiting on that response. As a former Minister for the Cabinet Office and the former Paymaster General said in a written statement, this analysis cannot be completed hurriedly, but officials across government are focusing on this so that the government can be ready to respond quickly to the inquiry's recommendations. Well, we've waited far too long as far as I'm concerned, Dame Angela, and I think that many honourable members agree. Now, the other recommendation of an arm's-length body should be set up to administer the compensation scheme. Can the Minister give us an update on that, please, because that, again, is important. So, Dame Angela, I'm conscious of time, and I know we've got other front benches to hear, and I want the Minister to answer the questions. But I want to make it clear to my constituents and to all members of this House that I will join the Honourable Member, the Right Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North and the Father of the House, that we will continue to relentlessly pursue this issue until justice is delivered.
Yeah.
Opposition, Shadow Minister Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Dame Angela. And I also want to pay tribute to the member for Kingston upon Hull North and the Father of the House, member for Worthing West, for securing this really important and vital debate and for their work in fighting for justice for those affected by contaminated blood scandal. I know that all members who've made important contributions today campaign tirelessly on behalf of affected constituents to get them the justice that they deserve. And I'd like to pay tribute to all of them and other members who weren't able to join us today for their tireless work on keeping pressure on the government and to deliver for the victims of this scandal. The member for Llanelli highlighted that so many people have been waiting for decades, and the fact that we have seen over 300 children die of AIDS. And we need to look at how we can help those children who are still living with this condition. The member for the Central Ayrshire highlighted her medical experience and why this is so important, and the treatment that we've seen over the years in spotting that contaminated blood is so vital. But what about the people who were contaminated before this medical breakthrough came through? The member for Wirral Rest highlighted her constituent's case and how this is a long and upsetting and depressing process. And we have to remember that people are still living with this mentally. They are suffering on a daily basis. You think about the fact that so many of these people during the lockdown, what the mental toll this took on their mental health. Every day that this compensation is delayed is another day that they are suffering. The member for Southport highlighted the fact that we have to think about the carers. A number of our members highlighted this. The people who cared for their family members, their loved ones. Where's their voice and where's the justice for them in this? And no amount of money will ever bring back the fact that many people have had to bury their children. We have to remember the children in this. And this was highlighted eloquently by the member for Wansbeck, who brought his passion and reminded us that for all the statistics we have around this scandal, we are talking about people. We are talking about real lives. We are talking about the lives who continue to be impacted on a daily basis about this. And the member for Newport East highlighting her work and the work of the fantastic voluntary and charity groups who support the many families affected by this. We have to remember, even within the financial constraints they face, they still do a fantastic job supporting the many families up and down the country. I'd also like to pay tribute to some of those other organisations in group. The Haemophilia Society, Hepatitis B Positive Trust, Hepatitis C Trust, the Sickle Cell Society, and the families of thousands of people up and down the country who continue to help raise awareness, who've contributed to this inquiry, and who continue to fight for justice over the past few years and decades. Now, Dame Angela, this is my first debate in this chamber representing the opposition front bench, but it's also something that I take a deep personal interest in. My late mother suffered from a disease called sickle cell anemia, and I'm a sickle carrier. And as a result of this disease, my mum required regular blood transfusions. And these transfusions were vital to her life. And without those transfusions, my mum's life would have ended a lot earlier. My mum died when she was 60. But those transfusions helped ease in her sickle pain and make sure that she was able to see me and my sisters grow up, still my her first grandchild, and be able to live a life. And it's vital that today all blood is screened. to avoid the risk of transmitting serious infections. And I'm pleased that this has actually helped more people come forward to give vital blood. Every so often I get a ping from NHS Blood in terms of that call out for people to come forward and give blood. So it's vital that we have people coming out to give blood and knowing that blood will be safe. I'm happy to give way to the Father of the House.
She made very important points. But she reminds me that it was only 2 weeks ago that in the Jubilee Room around the corner from where we're debating now, there was a plea for people, especially in ethnic minorities, to come forward and register for donations of blood and of potential organs as and when they don't need them all. And I hope that she would let me agree with her that it's very important people are actually aware of the importance of being donors and of the gift of receiving donations.
Thank you, and I totally agree with the Father of the House on this. It's so important. We saw that, like I said, every so often we get the ping from NHS Blood, and one of the things that we tried to call for at that NHS blood donation was to have a bus in Parliament and actually get more people and parliamentarians to give blood. And through this thorough screening of blood has come alongside the emergence of synthetic clotting factors for haemophilia sufferers, eliminating the risk of contaminants from important treatments. And together, these important treatments have significantly improved the safety of blood treatments in the UK. And we now see that patients who have a low risk of transiting serious diseases such as hepatitis or HIV. But sadly, we know that treatments in the 70s and 80s put patients at unacceptable risk of contracting serious and life-threatening diseases. We know that in the 70s, people with bleeding disorders had transfusion replacement replaced by the new product of factor concentrate, which was produced by pooling and concentrating then tens of thousands of bloods. And as the Honourable Member for North Ayrshire highlighted, just one simple sample was enough to contaminate each entire batch and risk infecting thousands of people and causing that significant concern. And the tragic result of this was that thousands of patients with blood and bleeding disorders were affected with deadly diseases. And for those affected, these diseases had and continue to have huge significant impact on their lives. And without the modern effective treatment, diseases such as HIV were acutely fatal and came with horrific treatment, horrific consequences. Now, heartbreakingly, many of those infected had not lived to see the debate today and the prospect of proper justice and the end of this inquiry. The Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North highlighted over 3,000 people have died. Statistics from the Terence Higgins Trust highlighted that between the start of the inquiry in July 2017 and February this year, 419 infected people have died. And while we wait for the conclusion of this report and inquiry, one person dies every 4 days. This is about the human element of this inquiry and why every day we delay this compensation is justice denied to those people. And the impact of this scandal goes beyond the immediate medical concerns. My honourable friend, the member for Warrington North, highlighted the stigma. We must remember the stigma of those with HIV and AIDS, which they suffered during the 80s and 90s, with often disgraceful racist and homophobic stereotypes perpetrated widely, and the victims prosecuted and shunned while suffering with this horrific disease. And the disease associated with contaminated blood often impacts not just the immediate victim, but their families and friends. As I said, as a primary care for my late mother, I remember some of those challenges in the late 90s, making sure my mum got the right treatment when she was suffering. And I know that the many victims of those loved ones have gone through similar challenges in trying to get the right treatment, whilst they're often misunderstood and continue to be stigmatised by this disease. Now, I know that the inquiry is finally coming to a close, and the interim payments have begun to be made, so it would be remiss of me to preempt the recommendations of this inquiry. However, I hope that the Minister's heard loudly the concerns raised by a number of members in this afternoon and concerns that have been raised in other debates by members. And I hope that he can fully address some of those clear asks when he responds. As the first ever sickle cell nurse, Dame Elizabeth Anyan, will pointed out, it can be very hard for people suffering with infectious disease and including blood contamination to come forward because of the stigma. Sir Robert's report was published on the 7th of June this year and made 19 clear recommendations. It is frankly disgraceful that only one of those recommendations has been followed up. And Sir Brian acknowledged that it is a moral case for those interim payments to be made. So I'll ask the Minister to respond to a number of those claims in making sure that those victims get the payments they deserved. We can't ignore the impact on the families and friends of who fought alongside for this justice. So can the Minister provide assurances that those groups will not be ignored when the government finally responds to the inquiry? The contaminated blood scandal had life-changing impacts on tens of thousands of victims who were promised the hope of effective treatment, and it can be only right that they see the justice that they deserved as soon as possible.
Minister Alex Burghardt.
Thank you, Dame Angela. It's a pleasure to be able to speak in this extremely important debate. I have to say to the honourable lady from who speaks from the Labour front bench that we in government do hear what's been said today loudly. Although I am just a few weeks into this job, I've been enormously struck by the sheer weight of grief and experience that has led us to this point today and will lead us to hopefully our final destination next year. And I would like to pay tribute, as so many others have, to those family members, those sufferers, those carers, those friends of the people who were involved in this awful incident so many years ago. I'd also like to congratulate the APPG because really it ought to be said, listening to the debate, that this is Parliament at its best. Yeah, a tragedy that affected all parts of our United Kingdom, which has seen very personal stories reflected from MPs to this House, and which has brought together parties on different sides of the political divide to represent those constituencies and seek justice, and pay tribute to honourable members who have spoken up today for their constituents and constituencies. I'm confident that Sir Brian's infected blood inquiry, whose report we are expecting in the middle of next year, will deliver the answers that the victims of infected blood have waited so long for, and will make recommendations for compensation and wider recommendations to ensure that such a disaster can never happen again in our country. The infected blood inquiry has heard firsthand of the terrible suffering experienced by the victims of infected blood over many years, and the terrible financial hardship faced by many as a result of their infections and burden of caring for stricken loved ones. This government commissioned Sir Robert Francis KC to produce an independent study with options for a workable and fair framework of compensation for those infected and affected by the tragedy. Sir Robert's study, as everyone knows, was published in June this year. Following his detailed evidence given to the inquiry in July, the chair of the infected blood inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, delivered an interim report to the government. In his report, Sir Brian made the following recommendation. 1. An interim payment should be paid without delay to all those infected and all bereaved partners currently registered on UK infected blood support schemes, and those who register between now and the inception of any future scheme. And 2, the amount should be no less than £100,000, as recommended by Sir Robert Francis QC. On the 16th of August, my honourable friend, the member for Northampton North, as Minister for the Cabinet Office, wrote to Sir Brian to confirm that the government had accepted his recommendation in full and that interim payments of £100,000 would be made by the end of October to all infected beneficiaries and bereaved partners registered with the 4 national support schemes. I'm very happy to confirm that those payments were made across the whole of the UK by the 28th of October. The payments are tax-free and will not affect any financial benefits an individual receives. But as my right honourable friend, the member for North West Hampshire, then the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, said when announcing those interim payments, they are the start of and not the end of a process to respond positively and rapidly to the inquiry's likely recommendations about compensation. And at this point, I'd pay reference to the Honourable Lady from Central Ayrshire's comment. We understand that this is limited justice, but we hope that we can fulfil that limited justice as swiftly as possible and pay tribute to her work as a surgeon. Though it would be wrong for me to try to second-guess the likely recommendations of the independent inquiry, I fully expect Sir Brian to make recommendations about broader final compensation for the many victims of infected blood. In his interim report, Sir Brian referred specifically to bereaved parents and children and said that the moral case for their compensation is, quote, beyond doubt. Sir Brian recognised what he called the greater degree of personal individualisation necessary in determining compensation of this group of victims, the complex nature of which made it difficult to include this group of bereaved victims in an interim scheme intended to be introduced as rapidly as possible. But there can be little doubt that once he has considered arguments about this in closing submissions, Sir Brian's final report will make recommendations about compensation for a wider group of people. Sir Robert's study was commissioned so that the government would be ready to address quickly any recommendations regarding compensation made by the inquiry. And officials are now working across government, working together in order to produce options for compensation which can be quickly mapped to the inquiry's recommendations. And to the Honourable Lady's point at the start of the debate, we have the resource in place across government to do that work. We are doing that work, and we are doing it with the intention of being able to respond very swiftly to the inquiry's findings when they come. Happy to give way.
Johnson.
I am listening incredibly carefully to what the Minister is saying. I want to be very clear. Will we see a response to Sir Robert's review, which the Cabinet Office received in March of this year? We're now 8 months on, so I know that there's been political turmoil for many of those months, unfortunately. But if the civil servants were getting on with that work, what is the date that we will see the publication of the government's response to something they've now had for over 8 months?
So I understand the point that the Honourable Lady is making, and obviously Sir Robert's findings have fed into the inquiry, and that we will respond. We are now preparing for the inquiry's final findings, and we will be able to respond to the inquiry's findings as quickly as possible. I will.
And I've interrupted you, maybe going to say something which will answer the question I'm about to ask. The Cabinet Office asked for the Robert Francis inquiry. It wasn't the Sir Brian Lang staff. The Robert Francis report has been received by the Cabinet Office. Sir Brian Langstaff's report is expected in the middle of next year. Are we seriously expected to believe that we aren't going to hear anything more on the government's reaction to this Robert Francis report before the middle of next year?
Minister.
So, the Honourable Gentleman, the Father of the House, is absolutely right that it was the Cabinet Office that asked for Sir Robert to conduct this work. But those findings have now been fed in to the inquiry, and we know that the inquiry is considering it. And I draw his attention to the remarks that Sir Robert made, Sir Robert himself made on the 17th of August on the BBC Today programme, when he said the government are considering the matter and have said rightly that it's very complex. They really, to some extent, have to wait for Sir Brian's recommendations, because my work was really feeding into that inquiry, and I give options for them to consider.
I'm grateful. I'll try to intervene again. The Minister has fairly quoted Robert Francis. It would be possible for us to text Robert and ask whether he would like to say, if the Minister is able to give some responses to some of Sir Robert's responses before the middle of next year, would the Minister be willing to consider doing that, please?
Minister.
I'm very happy to have that conversation. Myself and the Minister for the Cabinet Office are meeting with the Honourable Lady from Kingston upon Hull North in the coming weeks, and I'm sure that that will be a central part of our discussion. I'm happy to give way.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to press this, but the government made it very clear that they would not publish Sir Robert's report in March when they were given a copy of it, because they were going to produce it and publish it at the same time as the government response. They wanted to put the full response at the same time. So is the Minister now saying to us that that was not what was intended, and actually a Minister telling Parliament that that was going to happen was actually misleading Parliament?
Minister.
What I can say to the Honourable Lady is that I hope she will appreciate that I wasn't Minister at the time. I've only been in place for a few weeks, and I don't want to say anything that is incorrect. But my understanding is that following the work done by Sir Robert, Sir Brian then called Sir Robert to give evidence, and then himself made recommendations which the government immediately responded to about interim payments. And that we have, and I hope that she will bear this in mind when considering the government's likely response in the future. The government said that it would respond very swiftly on interim payments. It then did, and then before the end of October, as we pledged, those interim payments were all received by those affected. So I hope she will take that as an indication of our desire to move as quickly as possible and in keeping and in line with Sir Brian's ultimate recommendations. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady and then to the Honourable
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
I thank the Minister for giving way, but as also a member of this APPG who's been part of this campaign throughout and been part of the parliamentary questions which were repeated ad nauseam to get a response. What was talked about in the Chamber was a response from the government to the Sir Robert Francis report at the same time as the publication. Not to Sir Brian Langstaff's call for interim payment, nor Sir Robert's, but to the Sir Robert Francis report. He must surely understand that with the 19 recommendations in that, victims and their families want to know, can they actually trust what's coming down the line? And the idea of keeping them waiting another 7 or 8 months, I think, is just cruel.
Minister.
It is, I understand what the Honourable Lady is saying, but it is very important that Sir Brian's findings are the final word on this and that the government can respond to them as quickly as possible. The work that Sir Robert has done is obviously informing an enormous amount of work that is going on across government at the moment to make sure that we can respond very quickly when that takes place in the middle of next year. Happy to give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you very much for giving way. I'm sure there's an enormous amount of work going on. However, if we look at the recent trend of one individual dying every 4 days since 2017, my calculation, if it's the middle of next year, is there's going to be in excess of another 50 people, 50 victims of contaminated blood pass away before they even see a penny of compensation. As a Minister of the Crown, you cannot accept that to being fair to these victims. What message will you give to them?
Minister.
The Honourable Gentleman will have heard me pay tribute to everyone who is going through and has been through this awful experience. But I hope he will appreciate that it's very important that something the government might say now does not cut across what Sir Brian intends to say in his final report, and that everyone can have confidence that that will be the final word and that the government can then have the opportunity to respond quickly in order to get everyone the support that they deserve at that point. Happy to give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Chris Stevens.
Can I suggest to him gently that he needs to be careful here, because there is already a significant lack of trust between those impacted and the government. Now, Sir Robert's study made a number of recommendations. We've not heard the government's response to those recommendations, including the setting up of an arm's-length body to administer the compensation scheme. So can I confirm that the government are accepting that recommendation?
Minister.
The Honourable Gentleman, I hope, will know that this is one of the things that Sir Brian is looking at, and that we will respond to Sir Brian's findings. So we take this enormously seriously. I do understand that there is a real desire for maximum speed, and I know that people have waited a very long time to get what the Honourable Lady called limited justice. But the truth is that I hope, very much hope and believe the truth is that we are in sight of that endpoint now.
I'll try and be polite about this, Dame Angela, but you know, there were significant recommendations from Sir Robert's study that were put to the government. Not all of them are about compensation monies. Some of them are about the administration, and so that the government is ready. So can we get some sort of response from the government on those aspects of that report, please? Because I think that will build confidence and will do away with the lack of trust that is out there.
Minister.
The honourable gentleman will have heard me say that we are working across government to make sure that we are in a position to respond very fast to what happens with Sir Brian's report in the middle of next year. And I understand that there are questions of trust for historic reasons, but I do hope the fact that this government has been able to respond quickly, promptly and to its own timescales on the delivery of the interim payments will do something to show that this administration is absolutely committed to doing the right thing. And I want to, at this point, move to answer a query raised. Sorry, all right, I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Dr. Whitford.
I thank him for giving way, but not all of Sir Francis's recommendations are about in the future and a final compensation scheme. Some of them relate to the support schemes that people are dependent on now. So why should those recommendations be delayed till the middle of next year when people are facing a cost of living crisis now? So surely, even if the government responded to the more acute recommendations, saying they want to wait longer, would that not at least be a start?
Minister.
I'll say again what to the Honourable Lady what I said to the Honourable Lady from Kingston upon Hull North a few moments ago. Myself and the Minister for the Cabinet Office are meeting with her in the coming weeks and be very happy to make sure that that is top of the agenda. I turn to the... I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
But
Dame Diana Johnson.
It's really not acceptable to say that the Minister is going to meet with the APPG as a way of deflecting from the very important points that have been raised in the House and the promises that have been made by successive ministers in the Cabinet Office to this group of people who we've been discussing have suffered for far too long. We were told there was going to be a government response to Sir Robert's review. That's what we were told. That's what everybody is expecting. We were never led to believe that we would have to wait until the middle of next year when Sir Brian produces his final recommendations. This was work the Cabinet Office put forward themselves to have this review so they're ready to go as soon as Sir Brian makes his recommendations. And it is totally unacceptable that the government are behaving in this way.
Minister.
I hope the Honourable Lady will not see it as deflection that we want to meet with her and that we will discuss these matters with her. So I'm sorry that she's unsatisfied with the response she's getting today, but she will have a chance to discuss this with myself and the Minister for the Cabinet Office in coming weeks, as she knows, because it is in her diary.
But that will be in private.
So for the sake of Hansard, the Honourable Lady from Central Ayrshire said that meeting will be in private, but I'm quite confident that at least one of the people participating will talk about it in public after we've been in that meeting, and that it may be the start of a longer dialogue.
On a point of order.
Point of order.
Can we take what the Minister says as a definite maybe?
Probably not a matter for me, but I do observe that in here we are on the public record, so the Minister might wish to make some comments that he knows the public gallery will hear and anyone who watches our proceedings will hear, rather than relying simply on a private meeting. Minister.
Well, thank you, Dame Angela. As I say, this is a continuation of a conversation that I'm very much looking forward to have with the member from Kingston upon Hull North, with the member for the Cabinet Office.
I appreciate time is tight. thank the Minister. I hope the Minister will appreciate that for a number of people that have come today to listen to this proceedings and people who are watching and people who will watch on playback, they may not feel reassured that the government are actually taking this as seriously. For them, like my honourable member for Newport West mentioned, people do not have to want to travel again to relive and retell what they went through. So I hope that the Minister will understand that, a number of us do not feel that his response on this has been acceptable.
Minister?
I hear what the Honourable Lady is saying, but I want to assure her that we take this extremely seriously, that this is why the inquiry has been set up, it's why we have engaged fully with it, it's why we responded immediately to the call for interim payment, it's why we paid those payments on time, and it's why we will continue to do what is necessary in order to see that justice is done. I would now like to turn to the point raised by the Honourable Member from Foyle on backdating payments for Northern Ireland. I'm afraid I have to say that I will write to the Minister on this issue, because I will need to consult colleagues in the Department for Health and Social Care and also the Northern Ireland Department of Health, but I will write to him as swiftly as I am able. I have to give way.
The Minister for giving way and for the commitment to write to me, but can he just bear in mind we don't have a single minister in Northern Ireland over any devolved area right now, and people in Northern Ireland are getting a bad deal because of this particular scheme. The government has today published a budget in the devolved space for Northern Ireland, so this is a very doable thing that this government can do. So please, please, please take it very seriously.
Minister?
I understand what he's saying, and I will write to him as swiftly as I can. On the matter of destroyed medical records that was raised by a couple of members, this is something that the inquiry is considering closely. We expect the inquiry to make findings on this important issue, and we will respond to those as soon as we can after the inquiry reports. To conclude, Dame Angela, to those individuals and others who are out of scope of the interim payments that we've already made, I'd like to emphasise that the interim payments the government has announced are the start of the process and not the end of it. There is much work still to be done. Sir Robert's compensation framework study has been warmly welcomed by the inquiry, and without prejudicing the findings of the independent inquiry, we fully expect Sir Robert's wider recommendations to inform the inquiry's final report when it's published next year. Until that time, the government will continue to work in consideration of the broader recommendations of the compensation framework study so that we are ready to respond promptly when the inquiry concludes its work, as was our intention when we commissioned the study in the first place. Mr. Speaker, to Dame Angela, there is a point I wish to make that bears much repeating. This is to say that there is no sum of money that can ever compensate for the turmoil infected people and their loved ones have faced. But I hope the interim payments and the further work being undertaken by the government demonstrates that we will do everything in our power to support them.
Dame Diana Johnson to wind up.
Thank you, Dame Angela. And can I just start by thanking everyone who's contributed to the debate this afternoon. I think it has been a very strong debate. I think it's a very clear debate in terms of the strength of feeling across political parties in this House for what needs to be done. I have to say to the Minister, I am deeply upset by his closing remarks. The fact that we've had to wait 8 months to get to the point where we've actually had a minister in front of MPs to be able to answer our questions about Sir Robert's piece of work, which we all welcomed. We welcomed the fact that the Cabinet Office were looking to get in place a compensation framework ready to go for when Sir Brian makes his recommendations next year. Absolutely, we support that. But the fact is, we were told very clearly that we would have a government response to that review so we could see what the thinking of the government was and we would know what direction the government were going in, ready for next summer. To be told now that actually we have to wait until next summer to find out what the government's view of the compensation framework Sir Robert's put forward is absolutely... I'm speechless, actually. I am so upset by this. We have fought tooth and nail to get a public inquiry. We fought tooth and nail to make sure that compensation was ready to go for next year. And now we are told this by this government. It is absolutely outrageous, and I will not be leaving it here. One of the honourable members, honourable member for the SNP front bench, made it very clear that we will relentlessly pursue, and absolutely every member in this chamber this afternoon, I am sure, will be relentlessly pursuing the government to do the right thing. This is not the right thing, the way the government are behaving with this group of people. It is outrageous, and we will not leave it at this.
Hear, hear, hear. The question is that this House has considered the infected blood inquiry and compensation framework. As many as are of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.